I never thought I'd have to follow my own wife to uncover the truth. But here I was, standing in the freezing night air, watching as she disappeared into the darkness, heading straight for the old barn at the edge of our property. Something was wrong. At first, I ignored the signs. Sarah had been acting strange for weeks, distant, secretive, always leaving the house late at night. She claimed she was just going for walks to clear her mind, but when I started waking up to find her completely missing from our bedroom, I knew something was off. Then there was the smell. Every morning when she came back, her skin had this odd, musky scent, like sweat, like hay, like something I couldn't quite place. And then came the final straw. Last night, I woke up to the sound of our back door creaking open. It was 2 a.m. I rolled over in bed, expecting to find Sarah next to me. She was gone. My heart pounded as I crept to the window. From there, I saw her, moving through the moonlit field, her robe flowing behind her. She wasn't going for a walk. She was heading straight for the barn. And now, tonight, I was going to find out the truth. I moved cautiously, keeping my distance. The barn was old and rotting, left mostly abandoned after we sold off our livestock years ago. The only animal left was a single stallion, an aging, black-coated horse named Duke. I crouched behind a pile of old crates, my breath visible in the cold air. Sarah reached the barn doors and hesitated. For a brief moment, she glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. Then, she slipped inside and shut the doors behind her. A cold shiver ran through me. Why the hell was she sneaking into a barn at 2 in the morning? My hands curled into fists. My gut told me something was seriously wrong. I had to know. Moving slowly, I crept forward. The old wooden walls of the barn had cracks and gaps between the planks. I pressed my eye against a narrow opening, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Sarah was inside Duke's stall. The lantern hanging above them cast a dim, flickering glow. Sarah's back was turned toward me, her hands moving over the stallion's dark coat, stroking him slowly. She whispered something, her lips moving, but I couldn't make out the words. Duke stood perfectly still. I clenched my jaw. My mind was racing, struggling to understand what I was seeing. Then, Sarah did something that made my blood run cold. She pressed herself against him. I felt my throat tighten. My fingers dug into the wooden planks, my entire body rigid with shock. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Her fingers trailed along his neck, down his side. She tilted her head back slightly, her breathing ragged. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burst through the door and yank her away. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, because deep down a part of me knew this wasn't the first time she'd done this. And that thought horrified me more than anything else. My hands were trembling. My breath felt trapped in my chest as I pressed myself harder against the barn wall. What the hell was I seeing? I told myself to walk away, to leave this cursed barn and pretend I never saw any of this. But my feet wouldn't move. I had to know the truth. My pulse pounded as I moved quietly to another gap between the wooden planks, hoping for a better view. Sarah was still inside Duke's stall. Her fingers dragged along his muscled body, her movements almost ritualistic. The lantern's dim glow cast twisting shadows across the barn walls, making everything look even more sinister. My stomach twisted. Why was she doing this? I had never questioned her loyalty before. Not once. But this wasn't normal. I inhaled sharply. Then, I heard something. A low murmur. Sarah was talking to him. Her voice was soft, reverent, almost pleading. I strained to hear. Ours alone, you understand me, don't you? Duke snorted loudly. His heavy breath filled the air. Sarah giggled. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. This was wrong. Every muscle in my body was begging me to run. But something darker, something sick inside me, kept me watching. I needed to know how far this went. Sarah's hands trailed down Duke's powerful body, her breathing growing heavier. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. My wife. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps. My entire body went rigid. They weren't coming from inside the barn. They were right behind me. A cold chill ran down my spine. I turned, slowly, carefully, praying I was wrong. And then I saw it. A shadow. Moving closer. A tall figure. Watching. Waiting. For me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Someone was behind me. I barely breathed. Every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. But my legs felt rooted to the ground. My entire body frozen in place. A figure shifted in the darkness, just outside my vision. I couldn't see their face. But they were watching me. I clenched my fists. Had they been there this whole time? Had they seen me spying on Sarah? I took a slow, shaky step backward. Crunch. The sound of my foot on the damp grass might as well have been a gunshot in the silence. The shadow moved. Closer. I could hear their breathing now, slow, steady. Not human. My stomach twisted painfully. My pulse slammed against my ribs. What the hell was I hearing? Another step. The figure loomed in front of me now. My throat tightened as I tried to make out a shape, a face, anything to prove this was just a person. But it wasn't. It was something else. A deep, wet snort, not quite like an animal, but not human either. I stumbled back, my shoulders slamming into the barn wall. And then the lantern inside flickered. For a brief second, I caught a glimpse of it. The light barely touched its face. But I saw it. I saw it. And my mind couldn't understand. The shape of it, the unnatural way it stood too still. The eyes, black and endless. And then, it vanished. Gone. Like it had never been there. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my breath shallow. Sarah had come back hours ago, slipping into bed beside me like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't been out in that barn, touching Duke, whispering to him like he was something more than just a horse. But I knew better. I had seen her. And worse, I had seen something else too. Something was out there. Something watching. I woke up to the sound of Sarah humming. She was in the kitchen, cooking breakfast like everything was perfectly normal. The smell of eggs and coffee filled the air, but my stomach churned. I sat at the table, watching her, my fingers gripping the edge of my mug. I had to say something. But how? How do you ask your wife, "Hey, why do you sneak off to the barn at night to be with a horse?" She turned to me, smiling. "You look tired, sweetheart. Didn't sleep well." Her voice was sweet, warm, but I saw it now. The lie. The way her hands trembled just slightly as she poured herself a cup of coffee. I swallowed hard. "Sarah," I said carefully. She looked up, her smile not fading. I hesitated. I wanted to ask. I needed to. But something deep in my gut told me, don't. So instead, I forced a weak chuckle. "Just had weird dreams, that's all." She smiled wider. "I'm sure it was nothing." Her words felt like a warning. I had to go back to the barn. I had to know. Not just about Sarah, but about what I saw last night. So that afternoon, when Sarah left to run errands, I took my chance. I grabbed a flashlight and headed straight for the barn. It was empty. At first, Duke stood in his stall, completely still, his dark coat gleaming in the streaks of light slipping through the wooden cracks. I hesitated before stepping inside. The air smelled of hay, damp wood, and something else. Something thick. Something wrong. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced myself forward. There were marks on the ground. The hay had been disturbed, not like an animal had laid down, but like something else had happened here. And then I saw it. A piece of fabric. Small. Lace. Sarah's. My fingers trembled as I reached down, brushing the delicate material with my thumb. My wife had left this here. But why? I turned, and Duke was watching me. His eyes locked onto mine. I froze. The air shifted. It was just a horse. Just a damn horse. So why did it feel like he was looking through me? Like he knew something I didn't? Like he was waiting for something? I clenched my jaw. No, I wasn't going crazy. Sarah was hiding something, and I was going to figure out what. Even if it killed me, I should have stopped. I should have let it go. But I couldn't. That night, long after Sarah had fallen asleep beside me, her body curled beneath the blankets like nothing was wrong, I got up. I was done pretending. I was done waiting. I had to know the truth. I pulled on my jacket, barely breathing as I crept down the stairs. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt thick, suffocating, as I reached the back door. I hesitated. A single thought ran through my mind. What if I'm not ready for what I find? But I shoved it aside and stepped out into the night. The barn stood ahead, dark and lifeless. But I knew better. Sarah wasn't in bed. She was here, somewhere inside. I moved carefully, pressing myself against the wooden wall. The night air was cool, but sweat clung to my skin. My pulse pounded in my ears. And then, a sound, a soft, muffled whisper. I froze. Sarah. She was talking to him. I pressed my eye against a small gap in the planks, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Sarah was inside the stall, with Duke. Her hands stroked his dark coat, slow, careful. She was whispering soft, soothing, but I couldn't hear the words. She wasn't wearing much. Her nightgown barely clung to her frame, her shoulders bare beneath the dim lantern glow. And Duke just stood there, watching her, still, too still, like he understood, like he was listening. I clenched my fists. What the hell was I watching? Sarah leaned closer, her hands too slow, too familiar. And then, she pressed her forehead against his. I felt bile rise in my throat. She whispered something again, something I still couldn't hear. And then, she reached for the lantern and blew out the flame. Darkness swallowed the barn. I stumbled backward, my breath coming out in short, ragged gasps. I needed to go, now. But as I turned, a shadow moved, not inside the barn. Behind me. I wasn't alone. My stomach twisted into knots. I felt it before I saw it. A presence. Watching. Standing too close. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. And then, a whisper. Right behind me. Why are you here? I spun around, but no one was there. My chest heaved, my eyes darting wildly through the darkness. Nothing. No one. The trees stood motionless. The fields stretched empty. But I knew what I heard. Someone had whispered to me. Someone had been right behind me. I ran. The moment I stepped into the house, I locked the door, bolted it, pressed my back against the wood, struggling to breathe. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't. Something was happening. Sarah. The barn. Duke. That whisper. None of this was normal. I forced myself up the stairs, my legs shaking. Sarah was already in bed, curled up, asleep, like she'd never left, like she hadn't been out there. My hands trembled. I slid beneath the blankets beside her, my heart still hammering. And just as I closed my eyes, she stirred, turned toward me, and in the darkness of our bedroom, she smiled, soft, knowing, like she could see me, like she knew everything. I barely slept. The next morning, I forced myself to act normal, to pretend I wasn't unraveling. Sarah was cheerful, too cheerful. She hummed as she cooked breakfast, kissing my cheek like nothing had changed, like I hadn't caught her, like I hadn't seen everything. My stomach twisted. She placed a cup of coffee in front of me. I stared at it, my fingers wrapped around the handle, but I didn't drink. Sarah sat across from me, folding her hands, watching me, waiting. For what? For me to ask? For me to break? I forced a weak smile. How was your night? I asked. A test. Her smile didn't falter. Oh, the usual. My fingers tightened around the mug. That day, I stayed home from work. I pretended I was sick. Sarah left for errands. I had one chance. I waited until her car disappeared down the road, and I went straight to the barn. I wasn't leaving without answers. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, that same thickness in the air, like something waiting. Duke stood in his stall, his breath slow, even. I swallowed hard. My heart slammed against my ribs. I moved forward, hesitant. Every step felt wrong, like I shouldn't be here, like I was stepping into something bigger than me. And then, I saw them. Footprints. Sarah's. In the hay, leading right up to Duke. My pulse quickened. I bent down, my fingers brushing against the soft indentations in the straw. She had been barefoot. Something glimmered nearby. I reached for it, lifted it into the dim light. Her wedding ring. Cold. Abandoned. Here. Inside Duke's stall. I clenched my jaw. Sarah had taken it off before coming in here. But why? Why? I straightened, and that's when I noticed the second set of footprints. Not human. Larger. Heavy. Duke hadn't been alone. She hadn't been alone. My hands trembled. I backed away, my foot catching against the wooden beam. Duke's ears flicked. His gaze locked onto me. And for the first time, I saw it. Something was wrong with his eyes. They weren't just black. They were deep. Too deep. Like if I looked too long, I'd fall in. Like they were pulling me. I gasped, stumbling back. And then, the barn door creaked open. I whipped around. Sarah stood there, silent, watching. Her lips curled into a soft smile, like she had been expecting me. My stomach dropped. She tilted her head. And then, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah stood there, silent, still, watching me. Her lips curled into that same soft smile, the one that no longer felt like hers. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to stay steady. "Sarah," I rasped. My voice came out weak, uncertain. She didn't answer, didn't blink, didn't move. Duke snorted behind me, his breath hot, heavy. I could feel it, the weight of the barn closing in around me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I took a slow step back. Sarah took a step forward. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered again. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. Too gentle. Like a mother soothing a frightened child. But I wasn't a child, and I wasn't imagining this. I clenched my fist, trying to ground myself. "I know what you've been doing," I forced out. Sarah tilted her head, her silver blonde hair spilling over her shoulder. For a brief second, I swore I saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes, like she was playing with me. She sighed. "You don't understand." My stomach clenched. "Then make me understand," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. Sarah blinked. And then, she smiled. Slowly, she stepped inside the barn, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Trapping us. Inside. Together. I tensed. I could still hear Duke's slow, heavy breaths behind me. I didn't dare turn my back on either of them. Sarah's fingers traced along the wooden railing, her movements too slow, too calculated. "This isn't what you think," she murmured. My jaw clenched. I wanted to believe her. I did, but I had seen too much. The footprints, the way she touched Duke, the way she looked at him, like he was more than just a horse, like he was something else. Sarah sighed, shaking her head. "You always were stubborn," she said softly. She took another step closer. I stepped back. Duke stomped his hoof. I flinched. Sarah glanced at him, then back at me. "You're afraid," she whispered. I didn't answer. She smiled. "But you don't have to be." I felt my stomach turn. Something in her voice. It wasn't comforting. It was expectant, like she was waiting for something. And then, she reached for me. Fast. I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat. Her fingers barely grazed my wrist before I yanked my arm away. "Don't," I snapped, my heart racing. Sarah stilled. And then, she laughed. Soft. Breathless. Like I was some silly child throwing a tantrum. I clenched my fists. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I demanded. Sarah sighed again. Her gaze flickered toward Duke, then back to me. "Nothing is wrong with me," she said. And then, she reached for the lantern. I stiffened. She lifted it and blew out the flame. Darkness swallowed the barn. I stopped breathing. The only sounds were Duke's slow, heavy exhales, and Sarah's soft footsteps. Coming closer. Too close. I took a step back, then another. My heel caught against the edge of the stall. I stumbled, barely catching myself. "Sarah," I warned. No answer. Then, a whisper. So soft, I almost didn't hear it. "You'll understand soon." My blood turned to ice. Enough. I turned on my heel and ran. I didn't care where. I just had to get out. The second my feet hit the house porch, I slammed the door shut behind me, bolted it, pressed my back against it, struggling to breathe. The barn stood in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was still in there, waiting, watching. A shudder ran down my spine. I turned, my body tense, and nearly jumped out of my skin. Sarah was standing at the top of the stairs, inside the house. I felt the blood drain from my face. She shouldn't be here. I just saw her. She tilted her head. "What's wrong?" she asked sweetly. I didn't move, didn't speak, because I knew that wasn't my wife. That night, I locked the bedroom door. I barely slept. Sarah curled up beside me like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't been in the barn. Like she hadn't just been somewhere she couldn't be. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. But where? How? Sarah wouldn't let me leave. I knew that now. I just didn't know why. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. For a second, I thought it was over. A nightmare. But then, I smelled coffee. And eggs. And bacon. The scent drifted up from the kitchen like nothing was wrong. Like Sarah was just Sarah. I forced myself up. Forced my legs to move. The hallway felt too long. The walls too narrow. But when I stepped into the kitchen, Sarah turned, smiling. "Morning, love," she chirped. Like nothing had changed. Like last night never happened. I gripped the chair to keep my hands from shaking. Sarah set a plate in front of me. I stared at it, but I couldn't eat. She sat across from me, stirring her tea, watching me, waiting. And then, she tilted her head. "You shouldn't go outside so late," she murmured. My stomach twisted. I froze. I could feel her eyes on me, measuring me, testing me. I forced a weak laugh. "What?" Sarah's smile didn't waver. "I saw you last night," she whispered. A lump formed in my throat. "You did?" She nodded. Her fingers tapped against the rim of her cup. "You were watching me," she said softly. I gripped the table. My heart pounded. "You shouldn't do that," she continued. And then, she reached for my hand, held it, squeezed. Her fingers were too cold, too tight. "Next time," she murmured, "come closer." I yanked my hand away, nearly knocking over my chair. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't blink, just kept smiling. I stumbled back. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house. But as I turned, Sarah whispered one last thing. Soft, sweet. "You belong here now." I couldn't stay here. Not after what I had seen. Not after what she had whispered. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. To leave. To never come back. But as I turned toward the door, Sarah's voice stopped me cold. "You belong here now." I froze. The words slithered through my brain like venom, coiling around my thoughts. I turned back slowly. She was still sitting at the table, stirring her tea like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't just trapped me. Like she hadn't just told me something irreversible. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I need to get some air," I mumbled. Sarah smiled. "Of course, love," she murmured. But I could feel her watching me. She knew. She knew I was lying. I stepped out onto the porch, sucking in the cold morning air. The barn loomed in the distance. Silent. Waiting. I needed to leave. Now. I turned toward the truck, my heart hammering. But the second I reached for the handle, the engine was already running. I froze. The keys were still in my pocket. I hadn't started it. Slowly, I turned my head and saw Sarah standing in the barn doorway, smiling, waiting. I was never leaving. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in bed listening, waiting. The wind rattled the windows. The wooden floors creaked beneath the weight of something unseen. And then, the barn door opened. I knew it wasn't the wind. I knew it wasn't an animal. I knew it was her. And I knew this was my last chance. If I let her go out there tonight, if I didn't stop her, I'd never stop her. I threw off the blankets and ran. The night air clawed at my skin. The barn door was open, lantern light spilling onto the damp earth. I could hear her whispering, soft, loving, like she was whispering to a lover. I stepped inside, and everything went silent. Sarah stood there, bathed in the dim glow of the lantern. Duke stood behind her, massive, still, watching. Sarah's nightgown clung to her. Sweat glistened on her skin. She turned her head slowly and smiled. "You finally came," she murmured. I clenched my fists. "Sarah," I rasped. "What the hell is this?" She sighed. "You wouldn't understand." "Then make me understand." Sarah tilted her head. Then she reached out and blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed us whole. I heard her move first. Soft footsteps in the hay. A slow, deliberate rustling of fabric. I held my breath. Duke snorted. A deep, shuddering sound that sent chills up my spine. Sarah whispered something. Too soft. Too low. I stepped forward. "Sarah, stop," I hissed. She laughed. Soft. Breathless. You don't have to be afraid. My stomach twisted. I reached out blindly. My fingers brushed fabric. But it wasn't a dress. It was bare skin. I jerked my hand away, ball rising in my throat. Sarah, what the hell are you doing? She sighed. Then, a soft press of warmth against my cheek. Lips. She kissed me. I staggered back. I couldn't see her. I didn't want to. My breath came out in ragged gasps. And then, she whispered, it's in your blood too. No. No, 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 no. Shut up. I snarled, grabbing her arms in the darkness. She laughed. A soft, broken giggle. You feel it, don't you? I shoved her back. Stop it. Duke snorted. Sarah let out a soft sigh. And then, a heavy silence fell. For a moment, I thought she had stopped. But then, I heard it. A soft creak. The barn door swinging open. A cold gust of wind rushed in. And then, the unmistakable sound of hooves. Moving. Leaving. I blinked in the darkness. Sarah? I whispered. Nothing. I turned and saw her, standing in the doorway, naked, her silver blonde hair spilling down her back, her body silhouetted against the night. And then she turned and walked out into the fields, following Duke, into the woods, into the dark, and she never came back. The next morning, the barn was empty. No sign of her. No sign of Duke. Just gone. The house felt hollow, like something had been ripped from it, like something had never belonged here at all. I packed my things. I didn't bother looking for her. I didn't want to, because, deep down, I knew Sarah was gone, and whatever had taken her had been waiting for her all along.